this is not really an academic panel, and this is going to be more of a policy discussion, which will try to answer what is all of this geoeconomic academic work here to do, and how can it be useful to policy. And maybe to start, I'll give a very quick introduction to the co-panelists. To my left, Professor Abraham Newman from Georgetown, who is spending a year in Berlin, and who will, I think, play the role of giving us a bit of an American perspective on some of the issues we are touching upon. Gabriel Felbermayr, who is a former director or president director of Kiel, and who is visiting us from Vienna, where he's now chairing IVM, and Ludger Wocher, who is replacing on short notice Wolf Reuter, who has to stay in Berlin, I understand, to negotiate quite important energy-related files. And Ludger has had many different lives in the finance ministry, but I think he's earned the title of sort of crisis manager in chief. He was involved in the COVID crisis, and now he's dealing with this little problem revolving around Ukraine. And so, just to kickstart the discussion, I want to rewind a little bit to 2019, when this commission president and the new leadership in Brussels arrived and proclaimed that this would be a geopolitical commission. And at the time, I don't think very many people understood what that meant. Maybe not the people who uttered these words themselves. And I think we're about to find out. And if anything, COVID to some extent has had a number of geopolitical dimensions, which maybe we'll touch upon. But if anything, the war in Ukraine, I think, has woken up the European continent to some of the delusions that it had happily sunk into over the last 50 years or so. And I think these delusions were, and I'll probably simplify them to three areas that I would love the panelists to discuss. One is the security dimension, and the idea that we could pretty much outsource our security to the Americans, for the most part, in the form of nuclear deterrence with the umbrella of NATO, and in fact, by extension, also to conventional forces, which I think Europeans, by and large, and maybe we'll get into the differences between different European countries, but Europeans, by and large, had decided was not to be something they would invest heavily on, and that we were living in a sort of end of history world where these issues could be delegated to others, if not ignored altogether. The second, I think, delusion was that economic integration, both within Europe but globally, would sort of bring global peace and general economic benefits, and that as a result, the more we were promoting economic integration, the less we had to worry about geopolitical tensions, but also the less we had to worry about dependencies that we were creating through this integration. I think that delusion, has lasted for a long time. To some extent, it's lasting still today in some areas, and I think there is a bit of a wake-up call there, but we haven't understood the full ramifications of that. And I think the third, but I think the list could go on, but the third I would like to cover is the energy dimension, which I think for the most part, we have treated, we've treated energy commodities as just a commodity, basically just a good that, can be shipped across borders, and that, we've built, integrated infrastructure to supply, but, that has no strategic dimension in its own right. And I think this is a profound political mistake, but also, and maybe we'll discuss that, and also an analytical mistake. When I hear economists talk about energy commodities as a good that you can substitute for another, I find that approach sometime misleading, because energy actually is imperfectly substitutable, and energy is not just a good; it's actually a lot more central to the production function than another good. And I think that's something that we need to approach. And so I think we have to approach these sort of, at least these three fundamental issues and understand how our relationship to the world is framed by these three issues. And I think we also have, because we are not a unitary actor, we have to understand the internal geopolitics of that. And I will want to hear the panelists on that. You know, each and every country inside the EU has sort of different views on this. And I think it's critical to get sort of internal alignment within the EU in order to be able to project a fairly united front externally. And I think on some of these issues, if not all of them, we tend to have quite profound divergences. And so I'll probably leave the floor to Abraham first with this basic question. You know, is there, you know, from your slightly external vantage point, is there something that, you know, the Europeans need to learn soon in order to be able to live up to their proclaimed ambition of being a geopolitical actor? And how realistic do you think this is? How close are we from learning?
Great. Thank you so much. That was an amazing introduction. So I'm going to address that general question drawing on research that I've been doing with Henry Farrell at Johns Hopkins that's been under the banner of weaponized interdependence. And, you know, it starts from exactly the point that you begin with, which is, you know, there was a caricature, a myth about that the world was flat. And, you know, everybody can laugh at Thomas Friedman and say, like, that was a stupid book, or whatever, however you want to. I mean, sorry, Thomas Friedman is like in the background. But, you know, it really got internalized in so many different ways. So you can think about, you know, the German Wandel durch Handel as like an expression of that. You can think about the four freedoms in the Rome Treaty. There's all these different ways that we believed, or, you know, many, I think, policymakers, industry, that the solution was law and commerce, and that was really going to neuter politics, you know, that geopolitics would be put to the side, and that we could use these global economic networks to just generate wealth, and that there would be no externalities to that process. And so in the work that Henry and I do, you know, the first thing that we say is just that the way people thought about these networks, many of them, was wrong. You know, that there was this vision of those networks that they were going to be very flat, that they were going to prevent power in those networks, and that really governments were not going to be able to interfere. There's the footloose capital, you know, there's a million stories about these things. And what we show in our work is that in many of these global economic networks, you know, even the ones that were supposed to be the most centralized or decentralized, like the internet, they actually have choke points in them. So if you think about Amazon Web Services as just one example of that, you know, the amount of concentration that goes through their data storage warehouses, you know, it's almost all of the information in the world. And that's why Edward Snowden was able to do, you know, what he revealed, what the US was doing, how the US did those things, was because the private networks of the global economy in so many areas are so concentrated. So it's not just the internet, but if you think about the financial system and what we often call the dollar clearing system, but those correspondent banks that are mostly American banks, the very a handful of them, they provide an incredible choke point for the global economy. So once again, it's this thing, it's supposed to be footloose capital, that you can never regulate it, it's very easily used as a tool of power. And in production networks, and then we see this in the export controls that both the EU and the US have implemented. You know, if you have a piece of intellectual property that is either American or European, you can shut down another country's airline industry, basically, through those pieces of intellectual property. So all of those are just examples about how these networks that we thought were so robust, decentralized, are actually quite concentrated. And what our work shows is how then the governments, particularly the US, but also the European Union, have started to use those, not just for wealth creation, but also to strike out at our adversaries. It really started in 9/11, in the response to 9/11. You know, the United States was scrambling, trying to figure out how they could do stuff. And you see in agency over agency, Treasury, NSA, you know, they start to realize how these global economic networks are not decentralized, and that there are these choke points, and that the US government has some leverage over them. So that's the basic story, I think, of, you know, when you're saying, what's Europe's challenge right now, is how do they deal in a world where these economic networks are not just about wealth, they're also about power, and that there is actually a topography of these networks where Europe is not always in control of them. And I think that it raises a series of very significant challenges, both for the world, but also for Europe in particular. And so I just want to just briefly think about, what are the risks of this world? And I think, the first is just that there's going to be miscalculation, that these tools will be used in ways that will have unanticipated consequences. There was an example in 2018, the US imposed sanctions on Rusal, the Russian company, and it basically was going to shut down the German car industry because there's a factory in Ireland that's owned by Rusal. It produces a just disproportionate amount of alumina, and it was one of those cases where the U.S. was going after Russia, but as a knock-on consequence, it was going to have these huge repercussions for Europe. So those are the kind of things that those are happening more and more. The second is just about overreactions, places where we go after somebody and then it can really spark a conflict, and that creates this decoupling tit-for-tat scenario. And I think we're seeing that with China in the technology sphere. The U.S. is basically engaged in a campaign to destroy one of China's largest companies, Huawei, and that's not just about don't let them get the next generation of encryption technology. It's really, it's about to degrade that company so that it cannot provide 5G, be the basis for 5G internet communication. And that, then of course, the Chinese government is going to say, well, that's very threatening for us, and you see this potential for a spiral. And then the last risk is that you generate alternative networks. That what I would think of as, I'm not a believer that the U.S. dollar is going to fall to the yuan very soon, but I do think that the Chinese are going to try to create dark spaces where it's difficult for U.S. and Europe to really see what they're doing. And there was a great Wall Street Journal article about Iran and Iran sanctions and how the Iranians and the Chinese have done that. In many, the trade in Iran with Iran is now back to pre-sanctions levels because they are able to do these kind of off-the-books responses. Okay, so if that's the threat, it's like decoupling, overreaction, it's like bad stuff is going to happen, both kinetic bad stuff, people are going to maybe go to war with each other over these things, but also economic. Why is this a big challenge for Europe? And here, I think the number one reason is that it is just ingrained in the EU's mission to not think about markets in this way. And so it becomes extremely challenging to think about the internal market as a weapon. The internal market is a huge potential coercive force. It is both a huge project of success for the European Union, but it is a massive thing that Europe could leverage. And it does leverage it in very funny places. I studied for a long time data privacy. And Europe is totally fine to say, well, you got to do our data privacy rules, because it's about competition. It's about, you don't want to have a race to the bottom. It's a very economic logic of why Europe needs to protect itself in that space. But to say, we're going to limit your access to our market if you don't do things geopolitically that we like, well, that's very difficult, I think, for the Commission to get into its brain. And you see the anti-coercion instrument that's being debated is like a first step in that, but every time it's talked about, it's that it would only be a deterrent. It would never be used. We don't want it to be used. Please don't use it. Well, if you're going to have a deterrent, you have to be willing to use it. That's the whole way signaling functions. Okay, so first is just, I think it's really about norms. It's about how do global markets work? Are we in a world where, we're in a multilateral rules-based order? You guys can all chant it with me. It's a mantra that the EU, has spouted out for decades. Well, that world has fallen apart, and there's this new world, and how can the EU respond? The second is, there's really a lack of consensus internally in the domestic political economies of the member states. And I'm just going to draw your attention to the debate, which I think is fascinating, that's happening right now between the Green Party and the ministries that are controlled by the Green Party and German economic interests. So basically, on the one hand, you have these political actors saying, you have to get out of China. This is a risk for us. We are too interdependent on these markets. And industry saying, there is no German business model if we do that. That's our whole model. That's what we created. Wandel durch Handel, remember that? It was that whole business model was to anesthetize politicians from security interests. The point was to say, commerce is here, security is here, let's push security over there. Commerce is going to be everything. And so the Green Party is now saying, well, that's just not reality anymore. It is, I think it's going to create a big tension in German society in the next decade, is to try to unwind that. What is the alternative? What is a world of non-Wandel durch Handel? Okay, the third thing I want to say that's really a big challenge for Europe is just that the institutions to act like the United States or China are underdeveloped. And that could be at the EU level. So like the United States relies on this institute, this agency called OFAC, the Office for Foreign Asset Control. It is like the bazooka behind all of these strategies I've just talked about. It is the thing that identifies the actors and marks them and then employs the sanctions. And at the EU level, there is not a comparable OFAC institution, and the member states don't want an EU-level OFAC comparable institution because they like to keep that power for themselves. And so that tension, is troubling. But at the same level, at the domestic level, you don't have these institutions. There was recently a German law was put into place to facilitate asset forfeiture because there wasn't a German law that would allow asset freezes to happen. That's the kind of the United States is just years ahead in terms of the expertise and the institutions to implement these types of institutions. And the last challenge I just want to flag is, is about who are the friends and allies that we can count on if we're Europe going forward. And I heard one European official refer to this as T2, like the Terminator 2, that the sequel is there a Trump 2 that then, can Europe rely? And in the Ukraine crisis, Europe has had to rely on the United States in order to implement many of the policies that they've wanted to implement. And they've kind of just, in my view, just tried to forget the 2016 to 20, that period, the Iran sanctions, all of that, and just move forward. But there is a real risk that the security interdependencies, not just the gas or the China, it's also the security interdependencies could also be elevated. So I'll just briefly conclude with some pathway forward.
I will interrupt you because I think this was a great conclusion.
Oh,
but you'll get to speak again. But the conclusion of an American telling the Europeans that they should be wary about what's happening in the U.S. is the perfect conclusion. So with that,
okay, I will conclude there.
With that, I want to give the floor to Gabriel, and I think in response to Abraham, there is. I think a new world kind of is opening up, and I think Abraham has really described it. And the Europeans say they're prepared to answer or to change their behavior in response to this new world. And this was the big speech by the Chancellor, who talked about Zeitenwende. And so I'd be very curious to have your view on this. Are we fully appreciating this new world, and do you believe that Europe in general, and maybe Germany in particular, is adapting to this new world fast enough, both in the military world, which is, I think, what the speech of the Chancellor was mostly focusing on, but I think more broadly on some of the issues that were raised by Abraham.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Shahin, and thank you, Abraham. I agree to everything you said, so there's not much to add maybe at this point. But your question was whether we are doing the right things at the EU level. And my feeling is that it will take a lot of time. We have probably unlearned strategic thinking, certainly in the German-speaking world, over the last 70 years or so. I mean, France might be a little bit different. UK has a more stronger tradition of geostrategic thinking, but after World War II, we have stopped that. Here in Berlin, in Vienna, in Eastern Europe was occupied by the Soviet Union, etc. And we think we need to learn the game theory of this again. If you look at how people at the Commission make decisions, how they think about sanctions, it's sometimes blatant how naive they are. Now, the idea that you impose sanctions on Russia and that will change behavior, that idea is strange if you think through the game theory of it, no? Because it's before the sanctions that are actually imposed that you would want to see action. It's when you issue the threat you want to see the action. And if Russia doesn't react to the threat, then you will have to impose the sanctions, of course, but you shouldn't expect much response. Certainly not if players are rational. And so, I mean, this is just an example of how the geostrategic thinking is underdeveloped in Brussels and in many of the capitals as well. Another thing that is underappreciated still is something that Abe said with a lot of force. You said that the most potent weapon that we have in Europe is our single market, and that is so true. It always was so true. If I'm a trade economist and I followed trade policy for many years. It always was about granting or denying access to the single market. This is how we could leverage European power in one or the other way. Even the Brussels effect relies on that. Or you mentioned data regulation. This is always about the single market. And my feeling is that this is not commonly understood. So. That's why I'm very grateful, Shahin, that you say we need, if we want to project power externally, we need to get our homework done internally first. And the risk that I see is that we do new instruments, the anti-coercion instrument, the international procurement instrument, the border carbon adjustment mechanism, long list of things with a lot of geostrategic loading. We do all that, and at the same time we don't get the homework done. And without the access to the single market, all those instruments don't have power. It's like having a gun and no ammunition. In that sense, you can view Brexit as even a bigger catastrophe as it already is. You can view the internal divisions as even a bigger issue. If you look at how, Volker Nietzsche somewhere here, he's done work on how internal borders in Europe still impair the flow of goods and services. Over the last 10 or 15 years, not much progress has occurred. Europe is still fragmented. I think if Europeans have to understand that if they want to play a role in that big great power rivalry, they have to get the single market right. We need to push for more integration in Europe. We have to use the euro strategically. We're not doing that. In this country, the discussion is almost exclusively of the euro as a means to distribute money away from the Germans to the Italians and something like that. And the geostrategic role of the euro is not recognized. Now, if you do back on the envelope calculations of how the depreciation of the euro actually boosts inflation in Europe, and you come up with estimates of, let's say, almost 1 percentage point, that's because 50% of our external trade is not in euro, but in dollars. And so the fact that the euro is not a fully global currency is an economic problem, and people are not aware of that. So I think we need to get these basic principles right. And one thing that I want to mention, because I mention it whenever I have the occasion, and I think here it will be preaching to the choir. Those networks, they are, I think this is identifying those choke points. That is what we need to do, and if we want to make ourselves more resilient, we need to identify those choke points. Now we can rely on case stories, on anecdotes, on special examples from Huawei to Rusal and so on. But we would rather have, as economists, a better description of the underlying economics, and so that would be firm-to-firm business relations. In Europe, we have that in Hungary. I think there's in Belgium. There's data on input-output relationships between firms, but in Germany, no way. In France, no way. And without that information, we can only speculate about those choke points. Or identify them casually, here, and here, and then always be surprised when another node turns out to be a choke point, which no one has thought about. So I think strategic intelligence or supply chain intelligence is something that the Europeans need to invest a lot of money in to get access to the data, to get a better representation of the value-added networks that we are in, and to identify those choke points. Otherwise, we talk about strategic inputs and all these things. I mean, everyone talks about it. No one knows what it is, and we'll just feed lobbyists if we don't have the data. So I guess that's not controversial, but it's a real big gap now that we need to bridge. So I'll stop here, and you'll speak. Let me speak later once more.
Thank you, Gabriel. I'm going to use the fact that we have a policy practitioner on the panel to ask him two questions. One is that you've worked on the COVID and you're working on this Ukrainian crisis. It's striking to me that between March 2020 and June, so short space of 3 months, the EU basically agreed to, in my view, quite three fundamental things. One was to agree on a common procurement and a distribution mechanism for vaccines. The other was to agree on a common borrowing to basically respond economically to the shock that the COVID crisis would impart. And three, to agree on a broad framework of coordination of economic policies at the national level so that we don't all bail out whoever, but we try to have a systematic way of approaching this. We're now almost 9 months into this Ukrainian crisis, and it feels to me, but maybe you'll have a different perception, that we have not achieved quite the same extent of EU common response to the Ukrainian crisis. There is, on one hand, a great deal of unanimity and cohesion when it comes to sanctions, at least for now. Maybe this is going to waver as well, but at least for now. But when it comes to the military support, the financial support, the energy integration or collaboration as a result of that, we seem to be very far behind what we had achieved in the COVID crisis. So I'd love to have your view on that tension and how good or bad are we doing with the European dimension of the response. And the second question, I think, speaks to what Gabriel raised. This is an academic forum. How is the work that people in research can be useful for policymakers? And I have one example in mind, which we have discussed over lunch, which is, when economists were asked to evaluate what would be the cost of a gas and oil embargo, a pretty fundamental question at the time for policymakers. The reaction was, the response was a real cacophony. Right? So there was a solid paper presented by a number of German economists, but which did not produce a consensus, which was highly disputed by some economists, but also by the German, in particular, business sector. And so how can basically the input of research can be useful to the policy process? And if you could maybe speak to that example in particular, or if that's too controversial to in general terms, how academic research can be useful to the policy process. And not, 2 years after the fact, but live when you guys have to take decisions.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks for having me, and sorry that Wolf can't be here, but he's actually involved in what we are just discussing. So maybe I can answer the second question first, because it's also a little bit a comment and maybe also a contradiction for the sake of discussion to what you just said. I think there's a lot of strategic thinking on European and also on governmental level. I think the issue is to translate these strategic thinking from the political level into actionable policies and to manage these tension in between. In geoeconomics, we would say interdependency and and maybe economic security, or however you want to call this. And this is the issue. The actual translation mechanisms into policies are a problem, and I think this was also. We also observed this with this discussion about this paper of Rudi Bachmann et al. And I think it was a very good paper because it fostered discussion in politics, but also in economics and also in our administration. We had very serious discussions with the authors. But we as economists, we also have to recognize it's not only us who shape the discussion. And maybe it's less us than other pressure groups nowadays in the media, in social media, and also in business and around economic policies. So there were other voices, and obviously other voices were taken into concern as well. And if we look at the situation now, we know that they were not, at least as far as I can judge, not so far off with what they said. So they made a good contribution, I think, for the discussion. How this all will end, I don't know yet. But I think to foster this discussion as economists, to bring it into the public space is very important.
Just to clarify, because I'm not sure it's clear to everyone, you're saying Bachmann and all were not too far off, huh?
They were not too far off to kickstart this discussion. If they were actually right with what they said, they themselves had their doubts, but it was a serious paper. It was a serious contribution to the discussion, and I think it's important to do this. Maybe also to contradict this, but that's part of the economic discussion and also of the policy discussion. It's very important, and it's important to fight about this in public. That's it. That was my point. And on the first question, actually, COVID versus nowadays crisis, I think much of it has also to do with the characteristics of the crisis. In COVID, we had a demand and supply side shock, which was intended by ourselves, was introduced by ourselves, and managed to some extent by ourselves. Relatively quickly, that's true. If targeted, I don't know. We might discuss if there are better instruments or if we have more technical work to do. And I think the nowadays crisis around Russia and Ukraine, it hasn't started on the 24th of February. And maybe to some people from the intelligence world and some insiders, it was foreseeable that something like this could happen. But actually, I didn't believe it. And many of us didn't. Although, besides economics, I have also a military background. I still didn't believe it. I didn't believe the foresights of our intelligence services. And I didn't believe what the Americans told us mid-December. So this crisis was, forgive my language, but in a way was forced upon us. And it's still a political realignment process, at least in Germany, and I think also in parts of Europe, going on around this crisis and around this Zeitenwende, as our chancellor called it. So this will take more time to develop and to show up in political processes. And also the economic consequences of it are not as clearly shaped as they used to be in the COVID crisis, I think.
I agree. And I think one of the big differences between Corona and what we have now is that the burden is very unevenly distributed. So if you look at forecasts of how countries will suffer from the energy crisis, there is a big interval, and that was not the case with Corona. The more closer you are, the more dependent on Russia you are, the heavier the burden, and that makes the internal politics of it so much more complicated, I guess. Now many say, well, dear Germans, no, you've been preaching fiscal austerity, and you have at the same time taken enormous risks on the energy side, and it's not that there have not been any warnings. No, the Polish have gone down a very Poland has gone down a very different road, and I think that story of 20 years, no, is now there, is a burden, and we didn't have that with the Corona crisis.
Yeah, and I also think we have to have a serious discussion about who bears the cost of this crisis and countermeasures for this crisis, right? And initially, or finally, it will also be a discussion about the role of the state. Which public goods are really in the domain of the state, which are in the domain of the public in general, and which are in the domain of the business. The panel yesterday alluded to it, and I carefully listened to what Laura, Bruno, and Guntram said yesterday and their advice on this. And I think this is very important. And this is already part of the translation into actionable politics I'm searching for, and that's why I'm here, basically.
But these boundaries between public, private, household are also shifting with the crisis, right? So, I remember the point made by Bruno yesterday about Uniper being bailed out and how, and I think I disagreed with his view, because Uniper, was not acting as an independent business actor there. It was basically pursuing and advancing a political strategy supported, financed, politically endorsed by the federal government. So to some extent that the federal government today is bailing out a company for implementing what was, after all, a political strategy, to me is not entirely unreasonable. And the fact that now the German government, as well as other European governments, by the way, is forced to basically cushion the cost of this energy crisis is also, an admittance that, governments have somewhat failed to provide an essential good of, energy security, and therefore they have to pay the price for it today. So I think these boundaries between what's public and private are being blurred in cases of crisis.
I don't know whether you've discussed it yesterday, but of course the big issue is moral hazard. The bailout state, as the Economist had a nice section on it recently. I think that I think governments are forced, the German government is forced into doing what they do, and you gave the right explanation, but it's nonetheless an issue that weakens resilience. Because if you believe that your supply chain bottlenecks will be dealt with, you might run in a choke point, but the government then will take care of you and cushion it off. You might not have the right incentives to build a resilient business model, and that, I guess, should be in our at least at the back of our brains all the time when we discuss these sort of measures.
I'll return to you, Abe, with maybe a little provocation on NATO. If I take what you were saying before I interrupted you, you indicated that we should maybe look at the US as potentially a withdrawing actor, both from the global stage, but maybe in particular from Europe. Does that mean that it's unwise for the Europeans to continue to bet on NATO as an absolute security guarantee? And should that compel Europeans to build an alternative or at least a complement to NATO? Or is that where you were headed before I interrupted you, or not really?
I mean, that wasn't really where I was going, but I just think the current Russia crisis, it demonstrates the total dependence of the European Union on the US military power. So I don't think that there is like a credible military strategy that's an alternative. It's more, my focus is more on geoeconomic issues, and that's a place where Europe has lots of resources to become a credible alternative to the U.S. power, and also to create, a little bit more, whether you use the word sovereignty, autonomy, there's a list of jargony, words that the EU uses. But, if you take that seriously, the crisis that happened when the United States pulled out of the Iran deal and basically said, it's our way or the highway, Europe had no answer to that. Instex, it's like, come on, like, there's nothing. And so that didn't have to be true. That's because Europe really has to think of a whole new way of thinking about how the global economy functions. And that's why I also think this question about moral hazard and, this was a decades-long political agenda that the German government perpetrated, to get cheap gas for a political deal, because it was an argument that commerce and security could be separated. That Wandel durch Handel, that was the idea to anesthetize the political sphere, and it was a coalition that was not just about the political elite, but it was also the capitalist class. It was like, it made a lot of money for them. And it was also nicely supported by civil society, because there were a lot of Germans who said, we don't want to be a nationalist country. We need to be about, the whole peace movement. So this isn't just like companies are being reckless, and it was I think you can say, a kind of corporatist agreement of this is how the German economy functions. And so the bailout, of course, it has to be a societal bailout, but I also think the important element to it is to think about how it fits in Europe. And I think you could say that many of the other member states are being surprisingly generous in their, like, yes, the Spanish, the energy minister was like, I'm going to stick it to you with it. But in general, like, there is a lot of collaboration. I think on the U.S. going forward, I think that the key is that Europe has to develop autonomy where it can, and I think it shouldn't look to NATO. It should look to its internal market. That's where it can be an autonomous actor.
Thank you. I think with that, I will open to questions from the room, if there are any. Yes, just behind you.
Just about the last remark and the last question, actually. Do you think that the US would allow Europe to become a strategically independent defense institution in Europe, making the US obsolete as a partner in the defense activities? Or, with other words, is that in the interest of the US to do that?
It is not in the interests of the US to have an independent security. I mean, well, you know, it's a very complicated conversation. It seems like an easy answer, but it's like, whose interest in the US? Do you know what I mean? Is it in the US geostrategic interests to have an independent European capability? No, because it's really nice to have a dependent, you know, that basically can't stand up. But, you know, if you go to Donald Trump's base, you know, they're saying, why are we forking over this dough? We don't care about geostrategic what. You know, all we care about is our life here in Ohio. That's where I'm from. You know, it's like, so yes, Europe, go get your own aircraft carriers. Why don't you have aircraft carriers? You should. You know, that's what they're saying. So I just think it depends on who you ask in the United States, whose interests.
Ludger, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this discussion because I think it's a little bit oversimplified.
One addition, as long as I buy the aircraft carrier from the US, it's okay, right?
Always okay. Good idea. And the nuke sub. Go for the US nuke sub, too.
I think it's about the most efficient and effective equipment you can buy wherever you buy it from. But I think it's to some extent, it might be in other instances, it might not, I would say. But I think the point is that it's in the vital interest of the US that Europe takes over its responsibility, its right share of responsibility in terms of global security policy and politics. And I think this has also to do with the capability of the industrial complex in Europe. So it might also be in the US interest. It doesn't mean that there can't be competition, that there can't be setbacks in this regard. But I think the current Ukrainian crisis shows that we need to step our game in this regard. And this is also in the vital interest of the US, because otherwise it falls on their feet alone. And I think it's not what they are aiming for. And my colleagues from the Federal Foreign Office will comment on this as well, I suppose.
And just a very quick follow-up is I think people now recognize from the Ukraine war, you don't have to have an aircraft carrier, you know, to be able to defend Europe's interest in its near abroad. And I think in the United States, I think the military in the United States would say Europe is not, or I would say Germany in particular, but Europe in general, does not have the adequate capability to defend its interests in its local area. And what Ukraine has demonstrated is you don't need an aircraft carrier to be quite effective. You know, you can have just mid-range weapons. And so that's where I think most Americans would say, we would continue to provide the aircraft carriers, but please step up and buy some, you know, some tanks that work.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, so very stimulating discussion, and I am like my colleague from the Foreign Office, so I'm just saying I'm all in favor of aircraft carriers. But I have a question actually regarding the institutional setup of the EU, with regard to this idea that we can use the single market as a weapon or as a strong tool. And I'm just wondering whether we already have the right institutional setup in the EU to do that, and sure the answer is probably not yet, but so what are the steps we need to take, and what are low-hanging fruit maybe? I think there are probably none that are really low-hanging, but maybe there are some medium ones and we need to prioritize. And so my question is, do you have any input on that side? What can we do? What can we do in the near term, in the midterm, and what should we focus on? Thank you.
Maybe I'll start the response and then I'll hand over to the panel. I think there is an interesting moment that's coming up early October with what could be a first meeting of what was dubbed the European political community, which I think could help address some of what you've asked. And to speak to what Abraham was saying about Europe's ability to stabilize its neighborhood and using its best tools to do that, I think there's a lot that can be done with this European political community, provided it actually serves this purpose, meaning providing economic support, maybe providing energy integration, maybe providing, the basis of a military cooperation framework. What's not clear to me is whether this European political community will do that and therefore serve as a bit as a bridge between a long accession process and the core of the EU, or whether this European political community will just be a talk shop for European leaders without much policy substance and cooperation behind it. But I think if we succeed in making that an opportunity and a venue to address some of the current weaknesses, and I think Abraham spoke to that, some of the current weaknesses of the EU, that could be a great step in that direction. I'm not sure it will be, and I think we'll have maybe some answers to that early October after this first meeting. And I think my hunch and my fear is that there is maybe a preference at this point to have as little policy cooperation as possible and to just use this as a big powwow between European leaders and their Eastern neighbors. But I hope that this can be avoided. But I don't know if the other members of the panel want to say a word on that.
If you start.
Okay, this was actually where I was going to go, which is the very concrete, like what should policymakers be doing in the EU? And I think the first and foremost thing that the EU is very well set up to do is the technical exercises of mapping the networks. There's a lot of expertise in the European Union, in different commission DGs, to engage in that. And Henry and we had a piece in Nature where we try to map, say, do this, do that. These are the things where we need to have this work in order to make this happen. The place where I think the EU is least capable and where it needs the most work is that there has been an intentional separation between foreign policy issues and economic issues. It's not just that they're different pillars or all that crazy EU language. The Commission does not want those things to merge because of the institutional rules. The DG Trade does not want anything to do with CSDP and the foreign policy, and that is all like gonna bring protectionism into the land of the four pillars. So there has to be a new deal in the Commission that says, you know what, foreign policy and economic policy, they're the same thing, and we have to merge those conversations. And a good example of that is in Japan. They created in their economic council this economic security group. And so, you have to have that in the Commission, and it has to allow the foreign affairs group to integrate with the market and trade groups.
I think it's a bit too binary for my taste, because the EU is going down that road and has been going down that road for a while. There's been a big research project sponsored by the Commission that has ended this year on non-trade policy objectives in trade policy. A lot of criticism, even from this House, on not overburdening trade policy by other objectives. So I think this silo, the problem that as you described, this problem is recognized, and the connections between the silos are being built. But the institutional framework is 50, 60 years old. It's 2 generations. I don't think that things will be changing fast, because it does require a different way of thinking about the European Union, and that won't happen so fast. And the last thing that I wanted to say to the Foreign Office, maybe, we have 800 billion euros on the table in the context of the Next Generation EU program. Not much of it is actually spent. It has been designed in a funny way, money first, projects later. Now we think that we have a clear understanding of what we need. Energy, networks, maybe elements of a common defense. We have a looming refugee crisis, #2, maybe not in real, but at least in election campaigns is coming. And so I think we can use that money better. And it's on the table. I think we need to renegotiate that NGEU, and that would be something relatively easy to do. It's outside of the usual constitutional framework, and it's money-wise, it's already decided.
So renegotiate and make permanent?
I would rather see it permanent, yes, but even those 800 billion, we've spent, what, 150 are allocated really, or spent really. So there's a lot of money there. And if you see, you know, what's this, the condition of the gas network in Europe, the condition of the electricity network, etc. No? So even elements maybe embryonic, possibly, but elements of common defense of our borders, the money is there, and I think the strategic interests have changed. And for one, you know, it would be good to reorientate the debate towards these new realities. They won't go away, I think.
Okay. I'm going to let Bruno ask a question, and then we will have a closing word.
Not sure it's a question, but it's a very quick comment. I would have many comments, but the one that comes to mind is, it's difficult for me to speak about Europe as a single landscape here. The disagreements are profound, and that's actually one of the conclusions of the current crisis. We're going to have a very difficult discussion. Countries like Poland or the Baltic states, they want a more assertive policy towards Russia than the Biden administration. Brussels has been very active on geoeconomic, geopolitical tools, finding enormous resistance from Berlin. Berlin does not have a strategic culture. You have the chancellor say things like, this is a very dangerous war, so we don't want to have anything to do with it. He said that yesterday, in these terms, I'm not exaggerating. And France has been missing completely. So I don't know that France has a strategic culture, because in this crisis has not shown it. And then we have Ukraine as a potential member of the EU, a completely different culture. And we have Turkey, which could also be part of this debate. So it is an incredibly diverse landscape, and we're going to have very difficult discussions in the next 10 years.
Rutger, and then a concluding word for everyone.
Yeah, maybe as an answer to this discussion from my perspective, and also an answer a little bit to Bruno and closing remarks. I think if there's anything on the bright side, is that we have, besides all difficult discussions, a certain rally around the flag effect through this crisis and the necessities from this crisis in Europe, and even among branches. So I talk to my colleagues from the Foreign Office about economic policies. I've never done this before. No, it's not that I've never done this before, but we are having serious discussion across branches and also across governments. So it's not only the European Commission, it's in the Council, it's in between governments. It's also on the global level. We haven't touched on this. I think this is actually a very interesting discussion, what happens in the G20 and in the global financial institutions in future in this fragmented world. So if anything is on the bright side, this rally around the flag effect is there in Europe. What we make out of it in our institutional frameworks and in our policies is still open, but I think this discussion is actually a first step in the right direction in this regard. Thanks.
Thank you. Gabriel.
It's difficult to wrap this up with Bruno's remarks still resonating, because it is unfortunately quite right. I think Europe is bigger than the EU. I mean, the UK being out of Europe, and we don't have a strategy for our neighborhood, let alone for Europe's place in the world. And it's so I think what we should really focus on in Europe is the single market. We know how to do that. We have gone very far, and it's tough enough to go those steps further. Thinking about nice futures that could materialize is important, but the things we can do right now, I think, center around the single market. That's maybe I'm emphasizing that because I'm an economist, and here is where I see a lot of stuff that can be done, from the banking union to the euro to infrastructure, etc. And that is something that we can then leverage. And so that would be my conclusion. I think no one has contradicted me. Maybe even Abraham has supported that view, and I think that's, at least for me, I go out of this discussion and try to hammer that point forth even more strongly, because that's what we need. And aircraft carriers and the common army and all those things are so, given the reality that we are in, are so ridiculously remote that we should, I think, focus energy on what is feasible, and that's tough enough.
Yeah, I also will try to end on a positive note, because I'm a positive person. The first is just, I think, the remarkable resilience of the transatlantic relationship in the face of this crisis. I mean, I think the shuttle diplomacy that happened between the Biden administration and European capitals to get the sanctions regime in place, to continue the sanctions regime. I mean, it is nobody gives, Biden doesn't get any credit for anything, but it's remarkable. I mean, it is a remarkable collaborative exercise in a whole new terrain. The idea that you would evaporate the central reserve currencies, reserves of Russia. I mean, it's unfathomable, even just a year ago, and they did that. Now, whether you can think it's good or bad, but that required a unprecedented level of transatlantic collaboration and cooperation, which shows how adaptive these two parties are and how they can really innovate in this space. The second thing that I would just make a plug for is thinking about how these tools can be used for global public goods. There's a great book, a new book by Nick Mulder, The Economic Weapon, which, what he talks about is like when Keynes was thinking about sanctions, he was saying there's a flip side. There's the sticks, but there's the carrots. And the EU and the US are in the only position to think about things like the food crisis. How can they address the food crisis that's happening, in the world? We have the resources. So it's not just about how can we use these economic weapons for constraints, but also opportunities, whether that's food, anti-corruption, climate. There's so many places to think about how this could be a force for good, not just as a chain or a weapon.
Thank you all. I think I'll give up my time because we are running out, but thank you so much for this great panel, and thank you to the Institute for your invitation.